Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's class on mythical creatures in Tanakh. Tonight's class is going to focus on those creatures that are listed specifically in the Tanakh. You see their names mentioned there. We're not going to focus on angels. That's really another class in and of itself. We're going to focus on creatures that are very much animal in their description and appearance. Their names do actually lend one to consider them to be animals. So we're not going to focus on anything that is human or that is angelic. We're specifically focusing on creatures, and I think it's important to note that difference because the creatures themselves, they don't interact necessarily with the other people. We're going to see one exception to that, but the other creatures are not interactive at all. And the first one we're going to talk about is interactive. So unlike the angels, this one is interactive. The first one I will consider to be a creature, a mythical creature, in the in the Torah is the Nachash. The Nachash is the serpent. The serpent is the one who taunts Adam and seduces Eve, Adam and Chava. So he tries to say that he knows better, and he seduces them to eat from the fruit of the tree. He's a very wily character, as described in the third chapter of Bereshit. And the reason why I like to start with him as a creature is he's the number one, but also because, unlike other creatures, he interacts with Adam and Chava. He interacts with Adam and Eve directly. It's such a fascinating character. The idea behind the Nachash in Midrashic literature goes well beyond his very character in the Torah. The character we see in the Torah of the Nachash, we have very little description of him, other than being told that this creature, his punishment is to eventually dwell upon his belly, on his stomach, and to eat the dust of the earth, and to have a very antagonistic relationship with Adam and Chava. So his eventual existence becomes very disruptive and very counterproductive. So you find that the very primordial mythical creature is not one that seems to bode well for everybody else. So this mythical creature, he so what's interesting is that he has a mind of his own. Okay, we find that mind of the Nachash of his own evolves later on in literature, in Jewish literature, specifically post Zohar. But before the Zohar, if you look in, so there's a couple of sources that are really interesting. One is the 22nd chapter of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, and the other one is the first chapter of Avos de Rabbi Nassan. And in those places, we find the Nachash, the serpent, very much having his own free will, his own choices being made, bad choices. But we find that that's what he is. And the Midrash tries to put his influence into different perspectives than the actual text itself. So, as a mythical creature goes, the way the Torah approaches the Nachash is that it was a creature that was a pure antagonist in the story. The Nachash serves to be in terms of a vehicle of storytelling, is the antagonist. So Adam is the protagonist, the Nachash is the antagonist, and Chava is, in a sense, the victim. And this is one of the developments in the story, is that Adam fails to follow Hashem's rules, and as a result, this creature supplements the downfall. Ultimately, God holds Adam responsible for his decision, but the instigation by the Nachash is signs, seals, and delivers this punishment to Adam. The Midrash in those two sources I quoted talk about a creature that did have arms and legs, and specifically the Abbas Rabbi Nassan. It uses and describes the Nachash as the type of person of whom the Torah warns the Torah warns us, and specifically of what the Pirkei Avos warns us, that one should refrain from initiating conversation with someone else's wife. So I know a lot of people don't know a lot of people debate what that means to al tarba sicham. You should not speak continuously with the woman. The idea was don't try. Meaning the midrash takes the approach of don't try to seduce somebody else's wife. Now there is a prohibition of osach mode. Do not to not lust after somebody else's property or someone else's wife. But the moral and ethical code is, even if it's not a form of lusting, even to get them to become more enamored with you by engaging with them is also inappropriate. And this is one of the many interpretations of the midrash. It's far from the only understanding. The midrash is in Avos Rabbi Nassan is using it as a allegorical vessel to teach a number of ideas. What it teaches about the Nachash as a mythical creature is one that constantly involves itself in someone else's business and tries to input itself into places where it doesn't belong. So as far as mythical creatures go, the idea was that because it was so adept at inserting itself into places and trying to insert itself where other people were perfectly fine, the moral ethical approach to the Nachash in that midrash is to really say, don't be that person who basically ruins marriages, ruins families, ruins households. There's actually interesting, the one of the ways in which it talks about it over here is it says the following. One second. I had written it down, and of course it didn't say whatever. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, and I'll come back to that in a second when I can find my note on this. So in the chapters of Rabbi Eliezer, which is a different midrash, the midrash of Rabbi Eliezer focuses a lot more on the interaction between the physical and spiritual realm, especially in the early chapters of Genesis. The first time that the idea of the Nephilim, the fallen angels, appears in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, and we find introductions to fallen angels all over the place in it. It's a very interesting work of midrash, different than some of its other older predecessors, even though it's written in honor of and in the collective thought process of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who predates even Rabbi Akiva. I mean, we're talking about somebody who lived before the Mishnah. Its actual compilation and injection into Jewish thought comes centuries and centuries later. It's incredible. It's finally collected and organized into these chapters. So in there, he talks about the Nachash not only interrupting the relationship, but it's something that even Rashi himself mentions, that the serpent actually injects himself so much that he commits adultery with Chava, and basically that is the way in which he seduces her. And the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer even says that he ejected himself so much that he actually produced a child. The child is Cain, and Cain becomes the progenitor of all bad people. That's what the Midrash talks about over there. It's fascinating. So who is Havel? Havel is from Adam, and therefore he is the good side. So the Midrash talks about the two forces, within the same genealogy injecting themselves, but also gives a very human side to the Nachash. He's not a snake. He's not a reptile. He is very much human until he becomes a scaly creature. I'm not going to go much further into the development of this, but that eventually becomes the Samael, the Satan of later literature. We don't find it much mentioned that way except in the book of Eov, and it's a different character in that book, and we won't get into much detail on that tonight because we're going to talk next about another fantastic Another fantastic beast, and where we find it in Tanakh. And we're going to segue now. So you see the Nachash, which does have human parts to it. We're now going to segue over to the Leviathan, the Livyasan. So Livyasan is really interesting because Livyasan is something that shows up um, it shows up in Tanakh itself. So it shows up in Sefer Eov, it shows up in Tehillim, it shows up in Ishayahu, and in all of these cases, it refers to a very large sea beast. So there's a number of chapters at the end of the book of Eov that talk about two major creatures, the Livyasan and the Behemoth. But it's entirely possible that, say for Eov, we don't really know where it falls in the timeline in terms of its authorship. Some ascribe its authorship to Moshe Rabbeinu, so therefore that puts some of these ideas at a very early time in Jewish history. And others say that no, it comes much later, saying that it is a much later edition, especially when it comes to Eov himself is the canon. The main thing is that the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. This is in chapter 32. Interestingly enough, again, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer is full of all of these stories. And also, some people even identify Leviathan as the great fish in the book of Yonah, but that's not necessarily true because one other explanation is that there are even larger fish that are in the sea, which would be the tanin. The tanin is the whale. We still use concurrently, meaning nowadays, as modern Hebrew, tanin is a whale, and a tanin is said to have been introduced during the earliest formation of creation. They're one of the first creatures in creation. What makes that fascinating is that in that same chapter of Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, the Leviathan is even larger than the whale because it eats and feeds upon it. So it's not really a great whale. It's a great. There's an old joke about if you don't know what you have, there's something bigger than it. So that's kind of the way that it works. So what's fascinating about the word Leviathan is that it does come from the word like Levi. It's the same word, and probably related to the Tan and Tanin. So it's probably it could be either a twisted serpent, like so Levi, for example, the Pamze Helvani Ishi, right? When Leah says a blessing that she is going to ask that her husband accompany her more often, that child's named Levi. And the tan is referring to is a tanin itself is a word for a large fish, and it's also the tanin is also used in the book of Shmos to also refer to the Nachash, referring to that the staff that Moshe held, he threw on the ground v'yiyeh tanin. It turned into a snake. So that's why I like to juxtapose Nachash and Leviathan for this class, because we're talking about a Nachash does not have the interaction with the human world in the same way. It seems to be something that floats along outside of it. So it's mostly described in the book of Eov, in the 40th and 41st chapter. So the interesting part over there is that and that's in that section. The reason why I find this to be like the most important section about Leviathan is because it talks about at this point in the story, God is basically fed up with the way that the friends are not cheering up Eov, and of Hashem trying to explain to the friends that they just don't understand anything, and he says, he basically this section starts off with Hashem responding to Eov. He's appeared out of the whirlwind at this point, and it says, if you want to argue with Hashem, you need to bring some proof. And so Eov, I'm not arguing with you. So, and out of the whirlwind it comes up, and he says, I'm going to explain to you how judgment works. And at the end of this thing, at the end of this monologue of Hashem, and that the beginning of ways of Hashem it talks about first of all the we'll come back to him later, but the behemoth. Okay, so there's the behemoth. Okay, which is earlier in this chapter, but we'll come back to him later because he's not as cool as Leviathan. And at the end of the chapter, you can't. It says you can't draw the Leviathan from the sea with a rope. It's so huge. So he's you're not going to be able to control such a powerful beast, and you can't do with him like a plaything. It's so huge, and it goes on to basically say is stay away from this creature, and I will keep him away from you. There's no way for you to possibly relate in any way, shape, or form to the power of this creature. So the closest thing to this are some of the ancient dragons like Tiamat. But Tiamat was a primordial being in Babylonian literature. It was not this creature that continued to persist. Leviathan continues to persist, and Hashem makes use of the Leviathan. So it says that it said that the hold on. So he says that you feed. So in the book of Tehillim, it mentions how Hashem takes care of the Leviathan and how he plays with them. In chapter 104. Okay, so this one starts with, this is the one that we say on Rosh Chodesh, Baruch es Hashem. We say this every Rosh Chodesh. And it talks about how Hashem sets up the boundaries of the world, and we talk about the Leviathan halfway through here, and it talks about how Hashem created all these beautiful places to sustain the cattle and the sheep and the great forests. So, and the sun and the moon and the stars. And then at the when it talks about the sea, about all the great things in the sea, it says Sham an you have formed this massive serpent to play with. and that's that. It seems that the only purpose of the Leviathan is something that exists but has no actual interaction with the human race. It's just there, and we just seem to talk about it being there, and it's something that God controls and God takes note of. In a way, it's there according to the Midrash. Most of them serve the purpose of controlling some of the apex predators. It eats whales, and whales are an apex predator, and that seems to be the only thing that can take them down. But its description is clearly one of a mighty sea dragon, and phonetically, the word itself would be very similar to some of the other ancient gods and goddesses. There were people who worship other gods. What's interesting is that the word Nachash and Nechoshes do have that phonetic relationship. The word for bronze is Nechoshes and Nachash, so referring to the hard, probably the hard surface of it. And the other way to look at it is that this creature probably wrapped upon itself, and it was just so large. It seems to sort of exist independently. Now, the idea is that these serpents, this sea serpent, existed because in other literatures, in and around Jewish liturgy, and especially in the environments in which they lived, these same creatures were worshipped and found to be powerful, and the thought was that somehow they maintained some control over everything. But in the Jewish belief, these things may very well exist, but they are in the service of Hashem, and Leviathan exists purely for God to play with it. So that is the Leviathan, the Leviathan, in Jewish liturgy. It shows up in a number of places. I didn't go into. He's mentioned also in Yeshayahu, but again in the same idea. The behemoth is one also we just mentioned briefly in that same section of Eov. It's another monster that seems to exist, and it's just a very large or powerful creature. It has no interaction with other creatures. It simply exists to sort of justify disappearances of large flocks, like it does in there. And it's a name that it's called Behemoth, which is, so we use the word behemoth, but really behemoth in Hebrew simply means lots of animals, multiple animals, and it's meant to say sort of like the larger of other animals. It could be anything, and so that's what it refers to is this very large, powerful creature. So it just mentions it briefly. You know, he eats everything. He eats the grass. He eats the cattle. He eats the this. He eats the that. It's very powerful. So that's what that same section of Eo basically refers to, is that same feeling. So in that same chapter 40, Hashem talking again about these two creatures. They are mythical creatures that are supposed to exhibit God's ability to restrain all powerful things, and mankind can't seem to understand it or approach that. What's kind of cool is that it shows up again in some of these apocryphal books, and it is as I described a monster that does live on the man, and as opposed to the sea. And it's basically there to talk about these powerful creatures that they they would on some in some sense serve a purpose later on in life. So we talk about in Tanakh, we talk about these things becoming a part of some other greater purpose. And so what you basically find them in rabbinic literatures, eventually they become food for the great meal that's served during the messianic period. But he's not the behemoth is not as useful as some of these other creatures. I want to also talk about the next one I'll talk about is the last very large creature the Ziz is the sky creature, and it only gets mentioned a couple of times. It's again just like the behemoth refers to being out in the open. So in the book of Tehillim, it's mentioned a couple of times. So if you look in chapter 50 over here, in chapter 50, it is Mizmor Asaf, El Elokim Hashem Diber V'Yikra Haaretz Mizrach Shemesh Amvo. Right, that Hashem is summoning everything across the earth and everything the sun touches, and that Hashem comes forth from Israel, from Zion, and he rules over everything. And so he summons different things all around. And what is he summoning? He's summoning things that are to be judged and are brought as a sacrifice. And so he says, I'm going to reject certain things as sacrifices every year, and it's only out of certain types of service. He says, so it's not every beast of the field, for I control all of them. And they're talking about the behemoth over here again. He used the word behemoth in here. Here it refers to cattle, but the word behemoth is mentioned. And right after that is another animal that, in contrast, it says that I know all the fowl in the sky, the Ziz, this large winged creature, also belongs to Hashem. And so he says, the sacrifices are not to feed me, but when you bring the sacrifices, the idea is I will do for those that do for me, and for those who are wicked, then Hashem will basically hold them accountable for violating the covenant. So the Ziz gets this little mention right next to the behemoth and is referred to as the large winged beast. So what you basically have is you have Leviathan as the largest of the sea creatures. You have behemoth as the largest of the land creatures. Then you have the Ziz as the largest of the winged creatures. And those are most of the ones that get mentioned in Tanakh. Those three get mentioned a lot, but they don't have any significant ramifications in terms of Jewish practice. They don't get mentioned a whole lot other than in these few places, and mostly because it's entirely possible that when Jewish people learned about them or understood them and used them in the Tanakh itself, they were using them in allegorical senses, meaning the creatures didn't necessarily have to have any real. You didn't have to actually find it. You have to go find the Yasin or find the behemoth or find the Ziz. But since people talked about it, assuming it was real, it was framed in a way in which Hashem ruled over these incredible creatures. Hashem was the ruler of all. So these three creatures that appear all over the Orient were meant to convey that there were some powerful things that existed, but the authors of these different parts of the biblical canon were very clear to disseminate to everyone that these creatures were a creation of Hashem, and Hashem ruled everything. And that is to keep in line with the tradition they received from Sinai, that there shall be nothing made with Hashem in anywhere they go, that these would all be forms of Avodah Zarah. I do want to talk about one other Tanakh-based creature that doesn't really get mentioned in Tanakh, and it's not really fair to necessarily call this a creature. But basically, okay. There's the creature I'm going to talk about now is a creature known as Lilith, the night demon. It's Lamed Yod Yamad Lud Taf. So it refers to the night, and the reason why I'm going to mention it is because its allegory is mentioned. The allegory is mentioned in Gan Eden, and it operates in many ways opposite the Nachash. It becomes Adam's Nachash for all intents and purposes, and that's why it's not found anywhere in the Tanakh itself. It's mentioned in multiple places as the demon. However, the word Lilith is mentioned in Yeshayahu in one instance, so that's why they get the mention. And that mention is Yeshayahu 34:14. But it's really important to understand something very much. Let me read you the verse here 1 second. And just to clarify that the word itself has a source in Tanakh. That's why I'm throwing it into class tonight. But it itself doesn't, the actual character that we're going to discuss in a moment doesn't really show up at all in Tanakh. So the verse itself says the following. Ufagashu tziyim es'im v'sa'ir el ra'eho yikra, ach sham hirgia lilith umatza Allah manoach. So it talks about, this is one of this part of the story is where Yeshayahu is talking about the way in which Hashem rules over different nations, and how Hashem is going to hold them accountable for their actions, and that there's going to be such a terrible punishment for them that people will be left in peril and perished all over the place. And so what will happen is that Hashem will send his sword from Shemayim, and he'll bring it down upon different places. And it names different places. There is Batra, there is Edom, there is other vindication for these other places. And he says that that different types of animals will, as part of this, will fill in the space left by the people. So, since it's empty, what's going to show up in there? So it says that thorns will grow in their places, and nettles, and there'll be jackals, and there will be the yana, which is an ostrich. People say it's a type of raven. And then you're going to also see other types of creatures, hyenas, and then it says the sa'ir. The sa'ir is a type of goat, which also refers to a creature in the Torah. The shade and the sa'ir are used as metaphors for demons as well. There's a goat demon and a small sheep demon, and then there is now this other demon called the Lilith. which is also listed in that. So there is a Lilith, a Lilith demon mentioned there. And one of the reasons why we know that it's not referring to necessarily one creature is because one of the Aramaic Targumim, it says that you're going to find these Lilin living there, and Lilin are a type of creature, and so they're the type of small birds and sort of the icky creatures, demon creatures. That's one explanation of it, and another explanation of it, which is the one that Rashi says Lilith is an actual female demon. So he says that one straight out, but he is not necessarily the only one who says that. The Targum, the Ibn Ezra says it is the screech owl. So he says that it is a small bird which is, if those of you who know the screech owl is, a tiny owl, and it is it's more of a, what's what I'm looking for? It's more of an annoyance and a pest than it is the demon. But Rashi says no, he's referring to a demon, but not everyone agreed with that. So we'll explore Lilith a little bit here, because Lilith does get some honorable mention in here, and that is not any biblical, but no other really biblical text. The word, like I said, the word is there. So it gets a lot of treatment as the demon that kills children in the Talmud, and that shows up in 4 places in the Talmud. The first time that it's mentioned is the first time that it's mentioned as an actual demon that interacted with human is in the Zohar. So that's the really first place that it seems to be. And what we would refer to. It refers to Lilith as the demon that kills small children. Now, the reason why it's fascinating in the Zohar, the way that they describe Lilith is the creature that didn't want to actually have any children with Adam. She wanted to have Adam but have no children. And as a result, she focuses on simply having him for herself, but not to actually to build up the world from it. There is that is really what it comes from. That is really where the Lilith that we all know in Jewish liturgy later on comes in the Zohar is where it first mentions Samael, as I mentioned earlier. Samael is the evil, the Satan. He's the antagonist. That's what I was looking for. He's the antagonist, and Lilith becomes after failing to basically hit it off with Adam, and so that is where she comes from. But I'm mentioning her tonight in an honorable mention because, for the most part, most of her story doesn't show up until much, much later. Let's see. I have one more. Yeah, I think it's just the Zohar is where it's mentioned. I don't think it's mentioned. This story is not mentioned anywhere else. Yeah. Let's see. Unless it was mentioned in the book of Ben Sira. All right. So that's one note. There's a book of interesting parables called the Book of Ben Sira, which the rabbis did not like, even though they knew it. They were familiar with it. They felt it was not an appropriate thing to learn. It was kind of silly, but that's basically where it comes from. So I hope everyone enjoyed tonight the little class on that. We've sort of taken a step away from normal halacha to our discussion of mythical creatures. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Lilith. If there is some questions, I'm going to go for the next few minutes over here talking about that. So get your questions in, because there's a little bit of a delay going on to YouTube. So go ahead and start shooting in the questions, and I will just talk a little bit more about some of these creatures. So the one I wanted to go back to is with Lilith here is to talk a little bit about those of you who are really familiar with um, ancient culture will be familiar with this category, this creature known as the succubus, and that is kind of where Lilith fits in. So the succubus, it comes from the Latin word, um, and this is basically it's almost as if it was a bat of some kind, and it's a demon, a female demon that will often seduce men and then try to kill them. So it seems like it's a medieval thing, but it's really much older than that. So it basically feeds on having the activity, much like the demon Lilith in the Talmud also feeds off of that. So it basically, the term means to lie. It basically means to lie underneath, which is kind of funny because it really refers to. It really. I'm not gonna get too explicit over here. Lilith was not one who lied beneath, but she was actually the other side. So that's why it's funny though. So the succubus isn't really Lilith, but it's an interesting way to note it. It doesn't. It's a Latin word that they use, but that term doesn't show up. That term succubus doesn't show up until much later, um, and so it was based on things we learned from the Talmud itself. Okay, so the idea, so in the Zohar, that's where she takes on the form of an actual female. But in the Talmud itself, um, they tried to basically deal with the with the Lilith appearances. In some cases, some rabbis wanted to summon demons in order to remove their power from them. And let's see, every other sentence is cutting out. Okay. Well, hopefully when it loads up, it will solve that and resolve that problem. Sorry that your live stream is not working well. Any water-based female demon in the literature, like the mermaid, are always just in the realm of air. Fun. Okay, let's take a little. Let's take a little. Okay, so I have another blog called Le'olam Va'ed, in which I've dealt actually with that mermaids. So this will take us off of a little biblical tour, and take us to something in Talmudic literature. So the answer to that is yes. So it's an interesting little pithy line in the Gemara in Bechoros, where it's in a big discussion about what are considered the same types of creatures in order to mate them together and not violate the prohibition on intermingling species. The prohibition is known as kilayim, and kilayim are those mixtures that are forbidden by the Torah. You're not allowed to take one animal breed and mix it with another. You're not allowed to take linen and mix it with wool. So animal breed is a little bit more broad. Don't mix that. But with garments, it's simply don't mix linen and wool together. Those are all kilayim. And kilayim also refer to taking wheat and grape and olive seed and planting them in a hole together. And beyond that is also planting other species of plants too close from each other, where they will draw sustenance or take sustenance from the ground too close to another vegetable. So there is a statement in the Talmud there that says hadalfinim ein bahem mishum kilayim. It says the dalfinim. What are the dalfinim? So Rashi says it's the siren. He says it's half man, half fish, and he says it's the siren. So in Old French, the siren. So the siren refers to the Greek creature that used to call out. Those of you who remember the trials, the story of Odysseus, or of that Greek story. They are summoned to the island. Him and his compatriots are summoned to the island by the sirens and end up perishing. The actual mermaids themselves are often the dugong creatures, these mammals that live in along the Mediterranean and Red Sea. That apparently when it's really bad, really malnourished at sea, a dugong looks like an actual female, a very fat, round female swimming in the ocean. So they thought that there were women living in the ocean. And then they would hear sounds. Probably the sounds were just also from the malnourishment and other such things. However, I took opportunity to look at this creature that allows you to produce human offspring from it. Since it produces human offspring, it was not considered to be Kalayim. Much like we just talked about, the Nachash also produced Kayin in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. So Chava wasn't violating Kalayim either, but the Nachash kind of was a human according to that kind of opinion. So that blog post itself goes into talking about mating with alien species and what would result from it. I talk about a lot of different interesting things. I talk about how that there would be a potential difference when you create an anthropomorphic animal creature versus a humanoid that has some it's a humanoid that has animal features. An anthropomorphic animal would still be animal. One wouldn't be allowed to. So I gave the example. I use a Star Wars analogy. You couldn't mate with a Trandoshan and a Wookiee, but you could mate with a Twi'lek or a Togruta. Why? Because the Twi'lek and the Togruta in Star Wars lore were humanoid. And then I went over in the same blog post talk about Lord of the Rings. Humans and elves and all could all mate with each other, but apparently halflings, aka hobbits, they kind of had to stick to their own. They were not necessarily human. You couldn't mix those two, but humans and elves could mix. And you have some examples of human and elf mixtures, half elves. So then there was that, and then at some point in the world, there was people who said that even orcs could mate with humans, and orcs, as we know, are basically the bad guys in Tolkien's story. You don't find there being any love stories with orcs. Tolkien, but we do find half orcs just for funsies in Dungeons and Dragons itself. So basically, as long as they seem to the statement would be that as long as they seem to produce humanoid offspring, it would technically be permitted. I even go into that blog post and talk about other alien species. I guess I got some Star Trek examples in there where you have people that are creatures that are basically humanoid all throughout the world, Falcons and Batons and other people. Then you have those who kind of are human and kind of are not. So you have, Ron also fit in there. Anyway, I don't want to go too off. You can look at that blog post on Lamba Ed, and you can check it out. It's a fun exploration of some of these ideas through the realm of science fiction. Let's see if I have any other questions over here. Let's see. The Meg. Oh, the Meg. I missed that statement before. Yeah. The Meg. I didn't think about that. Right. All right. If there are no further, so Bigfoot would be a good example of a humanoid. It's meant to be humanoid. The creatures we were talking about are unapproachable. And like I said, they don't interact with other people. The Nachash is the only one that really has an interaction with everybody else. So that's the main thing. And the main point of the Nachash is to show that there is this constant pull created in the creation that you have to. Yeah, all right. Everyone seems ready to check out. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out tonight. As always, check you'll get an update in about 24 hours when classes load up. Tomorrow we will have class again, Mishnah Berurah. So look forward to seeing everyone there to talk about more Berachos HaShachar. Thank you everyone for coming out. Remember to subscribe to the channel, invite your friends, invite your family, and then I'm going to be getting back to everybody about a time for a Parsha share.